I am thrilled to have on Bad Faith Podcast today Jeremy Scahill, a senior correspondent and editor at large at The Intercept, one of the original founding editors. He's a writer, he's an amazing journalist, and I'm so thrilled to get his input on the ongoing saga in Gaza. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Bree.
So we've been covering the siege on Gaza almost nonstop for the past 3 months. But you happen to be coming on the podcast at a time when there's been a little bit of a gap where I've diversified the coverage a little bit. So even though some of the news I'm going to ask you about feels a little bit dated as things are moving very quickly, I do want to get you to weigh in on some of the stuff that hasn't just been touched upon on this podcast, namely the ICJ preliminary decision that came down last Friday. There's a lot of angles here. There's a media angle. There's been a lot of conversation about the extent to which the mainstream media has downplayed the relevance of the outcome, which, of course, was that South Africa's genocide case is, quote, plausible. So the Israeli attempts to dismiss the case were not successful. It will be moving on to a more substantive judgment. But I want to get your first thoughts before we go any farther.
Well, first of all, we have to remember that South Africa had a team of international lawyers. They had a lawyer from Britain. They had a lawyer from Ireland. In fact, their lawyer from Ireland gave what amounted to their closing argument. And if you know a bit about her background, she was inspired to become a lawyer because she grew up in an Ireland which was suffering under the iron fist of British colonialism. And in fact, it was the killing of a 12-year-old girl that inspired her to become a lawyer. So when the Israelis and their allies tried to whole cloth dismiss South Africa's motivation or to say that their legal filing amounted to serving as legal counsel for Hamas, let's remember that they had a team of very, very serious international lawyers, and they presented an 84-page, meticulously documented, legally argued assertion that Israel was in gross violation of multiple terms of the Genocide Convention. Israel's defense, which was backed by the United States, Germany, and a handful of other allies, basically amounted to making procedural arguments that South Africa hadn't sufficiently informed Israel that there was a dispute between the two states. They said the word Hamas, many, many dozens of times. They sought to invoke the Holocaust and the suffering and mass murder of Jews as though that was somehow a defense in a genocide case. And of course, Bree, you're a lawyer, you know this. There is no sort of escape clause to the Genocide Convention. You can't use your own historical suffering as a basis to argue that you somehow then have the right to engage in genocidal conduct. What I thought was some of the most striking evidence that was introduced by the South Africans and really wasn't challenged in any substantive or legal way by the Israelis was 9 full pages of statements from senior Israeli officials and lawmakers, prominent members of society, engaging in what I think any honest observer would say are statements of genocidal intent. So when the actual arguments were presented, South Africa laid out a pretty devastating case, and in fact, they used many conservative statistics in their portrayal of the extent of the devastation, destruction, and mass killing that has taken place in Gaza at that point over the preceding 3 months. When it came down to the judge's decision, and again, this was a 15-judge panel, and then both Israel and South Africa got to appoint ad hoc judges to the court. When it came down to the reading of the court's orders, it was quite striking that the American judge, who is the president of the court at present, and in fact, she had been a legal advisor to the United States, Judge Jean Donahue, in the 1980s when Nicaragua took the United States before the World Court and accused it of what amounted to terrorism for the backing of the Contra death squads in Nicaragua, as well as the mining of the Nicaraguan harbors. So this judge was an advisor to the United States defense in that case, and the U.S. was found guilty and liable for having done these things in Nicaragua during the dirty wars in the 80s. She then went on to, the Judge Donahue, to serve as the senior legal advisor under Hillary Clinton at the State Department when Barack Obama was president. I give you this background because it was striking that this American judge, deeply connected to Hillary Clinton, served at a high level of the Obama administration, was part of the defense team at the World Court when the United States was convicted. And by the way, completely flouted the ruling and refused to abide by the findings of the court. She voted against Israel in every single count that was brought before the court in the form of these provisional measures. Now, for people that may not understand the nuance of it, I've seen a lot of really bad information coming from various sides of the dialogue. But what people need to understand is that this was not the end of this process at all. The judges were not expected to issue a ruling finding that Israel was guilty of genocide. What South Africa was asking for in this case was for the judges on a prima facie basis to accept that the evidence that they submitted to the court was sufficient enough to warrant a concern that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocidal acts or violating the Genocide Convention, just to put that on the table. What South Africa also asked for was that while the parties wait for a full hearing, meaning Israel and South Africa, where they'll be able to present a very in-depth offense and defense, that the court issue orders to ensure that the victims in this equation, the Palestinians of Gaza, are protected. And the court sided with South Africa and said, yes, we are going to issue such measures. Now, the court stopped short of the full spectrum that South Africa had requested. South Africa asked for the court to issue an immediate and direct order to Israel to stop its military attacks against the Palestinians. And people, including officials from the United States and Israel, have pointed to the fact that the court didn't do that as somehow evidence that Israel is not guilty of genocide or isn't violating the Genocide Convention. But the devil is always in the details, Bree. And as you know, as an attorney, it would have been almost unheard of for the court to issue such an order because South Africa is not in combat or in a war against Israel right now. It's a third party bringing these claims. And so people have said, well, in the Russia-Ukraine case, the court did, in fact, order Russia to halt its military actions. Hamas is not a party to, Hamas is not a state. Hamas is not a party to the International Court of Justice. Hamas remains the governing authority in Gaza. And so the court really couldn't have issued such an order. And so what they did was they issued an order that said that the Palestinians of Gaza represent a protected group, that this protected group is entitled to protections under the Genocide Convention. And they ordered Israel not only to prevent genocidal acts, but actually to stop, and they listed a number of things, and among them was killing members of the protected group, meaning the Palestinians. And so what we saw happen then, and sorry, I'll wrap this up in a second, but I just wanted to put all this on the table. What we saw happen immediately afterwards was the South African government, I think rightly, recognized the historical significance of this ruling. In fact, Israel's own judge that they appointed to as an ad hoc member of the court voted against Israel on some of these counts. Most of the decisions were 15-2, or in some cases 16-1. It was a judge from Uganda. And the Ugandan government has disowned that judge, but a judge from Uganda that voted with Israel every single time. But the Israeli judge, who's a very revered figure in Israel, did vote in favor of the order to stop and punish statements of genocidal intent, which I thought was significant. But right after this verdict, you had the South Africans, I think, rightly characterizing the historic nature of it, and also saying that while they did wish that the court was able to make a more direct order to cease all military actions, that the orders that the court did issue, the provisional measures, are not implementable without Israel ceasing its military operations. And it should be noted for the record, Hamas, in advance of this, stopped launching rockets at Tel Aviv on the one hand, but also very publicly said that they would abide by any rulings issued by the International Court of Justice, in this matter. Now, the court doesn't have jurisdiction over Hamas, but they did call for the immediate release of all hostages and captives being held by Hamas, just to note these things for the record. What the response of the United States and Israel was essentially, the court didn't direct us to stop the war. which, takes a lot of logistical stretching to make that true. And in fact, they didn't find Israel guilty of genocide. That's what John Kirby and other officials,
Right.
It's akin to saying that because a defendant is not definitively convicted at their arraignment, that it necessarily means that they're acquitted, of the charges against them. So view this as the kind of opening hearing. The evidence was presented, and the court said, we think there's a plausible case to be made that genocidal actions are taking place and that Israel is directing them, and that senior officials may have incited that genocide as orders were understood on the ground by soldiers. So what the United States has done is try to bank on the notion that people won't actually read the court's decision, or they won't read independent analysis or the history of how the court operates. And basically they said, hey, the court just told us, be careful, you can keep waging the war. And since that ruling came down, we've seen the killing spree continue. We have seen the starvation campaign continue. We've seen hospitals laid siege to. We have more reports of mass executions of Palestinian men. We've seen the siege of the West Bank continue. We saw Israeli operatives dressed up as Palestinian civilians in need of medical attention and medical professionals go into a hospital in Jenin, which is not in Gaza, and assassinate 3 Palestinian men inside that hospital. And then Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right Minister of Internal Security, posted a photo of himself with the Israeli media sort of portrayed as like the cast of the Netflix show Fauda, still dressed up in their disguises as Palestinian civilians and medical professionals. He posted that on Twitter, and they were celebrating this, and they said that these brave operatives had prevented an October 7th style attack that was being plotted in the West Bank. So we haven't seen the U.S. cut off aid, military assistance. We haven't seen the U.S. cut off political, diplomatic assistance. We haven't seen the United States say that they're going to respect the ruling of the court. Instead, we've seen the United States proceed as usual, and now they are attacking the main humanitarian organization of the United Nations, UNRWA, and they are waging a propaganda campaign. The clear intent of it is twofold, Bree: to distract from Israel's war crimes and the substance of the ruling of the International Court of Justice, and to continue a mass starvation operation against the people of Gaza.
That is such an amazing and succinct summary, Jeremy. You should write my radars, because you just managed to do off the top of your head what I struggled to put together and summarize in an earlier radar on Monday, which, by the way, I liked your arraignment analogy so much that I included it in my summary of Friday and the
you're a lawyer. Let me ask.
Friday.
So people attacked me, including some lawyers, and they said, "Hey, imbecile. People are innocent until proven guilty."
Not guilty when they're arraigned.
Yeah, right. They missed the part where I said, if they're not acquitted, if they're not found guilty at their arraignment,
right.
Which is, I was trying to, I actually try to make things plain for people that don't have the time to get into the weeds, but bad faith is what we see a lot of.
Indeed. I liked it. I used it. And I really appreciate you being able to lay everything out like that. I want to drill back in on what you just mentioned at the end there, which is the choice on the day of the ICJ preliminary finding, not for the United States or any of its client states or whatever you want to call them, to cut funding to Israel, but instead to cut funding to UNRWA, which is the UN organization that's dedicated principally solely to administering aid to Palestinians. Tell us more about that decision. And I want to get into this a little bit because people have been resurfacing some clips from the very recent history in the last few weeks where State Department spokespeople have been asked about UNRWA and they have lavished praises on it. And it seems that historically the relationship has been that UNRWA exists. It was founded at the same time as the founding of Israel to basically say, hey, look, we know that the UN's new project of founding the state of Israel is going to ironically create this whole other refugee crisis. This is obviously a bad look for a new humanitarian organization. So we're going to dedicate resources to administering to the aid needs of Palestinians. And we're basically going to not touch this as a kind of a compromise position because we know we did bad. And right up until last Friday, it seems, the State Department the United States stood behind UNRWA as an esteemed humanitarian organization. Cut to last Friday, and everything changed.
Yeah. And so what you have is the Israelis at several key moments throughout this 4 months of scorched earth bombing, whenever they get in trouble in public opinion and they are perceived to be doing something that even crosses lines of some of their supporters' moral codes, and it's, there's not many of them, but just one example, when they started laying siege to hospitals, then all of a sudden they produced these slick videos that purport to show a rendering of what they essentially described as like a Hamas Pentagon that was under Al-Shifa Hospital. And of course, that turned out to be total nonsense. I mean, the entire narrative that's put in place to justify this war, beheaded babies, infants put in ovens, all of these stories, the Israelis deploy these as an act of emotional and psychological warfare, not aimed at the population in Gaza, but aimed in many cases at their own allies. And the United States, at almost every single turn in these episodes, when the Israelis have made these outlandish, obscene allegations, has not only endorsed them, but in some cases has said, hey, we actually have our own independent intelligence that backs this up. That's what they said about Al-Shifa, for example. Joe Biden continues to say that he personally saw photos of beheaded babies, even though there was only one infant killed on October 7th, 9-month-old named Mila Cohen, who was shot as her mother carried her in her arms. There was no pregnant woman who had a fetus cut out of her body and then the fetus stabbed in front of her surviving children. There were so many lies that were told, and yet you see U.S. officials continue to repeat these. I say that because what happened last week is that the Israeli government, which has long hated UNRWA, and many Israeli politicians have viewed UNRWA as the single greatest impediment to Israel's campaign to end any hope of the right of return of the Palestinians to their homeland, their territory, their houses that were seized, stolen, snatched by Israeli settlers with the full backing of the Israeli government. And they viewed this UN agency as basically the Palestinians' lifeline to the world. And if the Palestinians have a lifeline, it means that the aspirations for self-determination and a state are intact. And so this has been in the crosshairs for many, many years, decades, in fact. What the Israelis did is they said, well, we have information we've obtained from interrogations of Palestinians, and we've intercepted signals intelligence as well as cell phone communications, and we've determined that there are 12 employees of this UN agency that participated in some way or another in the attacks of October 7th. Now, there are already problems with that right off the bat. I mean, the Israelis are known to torture prisoners. They've also put videos of hospital officials online that they've kidnapped and are torturing and abusing, forcing them apparently to make all kinds of statements about Hamas's use of their hospitals, a violation of multiple international laws and laws of war to be engaged in that conduct. But the United States' response to this almost instantly was to announce that it was going to cut all funding to the most vital humanitarian organization in Gaza. This is one of the primary sources of medical care for people in Gaza. It's one of the most important and certainly the most high quality education for the people of Gaza. Gaza is one of the most highly educated societies in the world, with an enormous proportion of people with upper degrees and PhDs. Israel has systematically murdered their storytellers, their academics, their professors. And so, the tactics that they used, we've seen for a long time, but the response of the United States was definitive, swift, abrupt to pull the funding for this organization. And it started a domino effect then where other American allies started to follow suit. This is a very, very grave development, and it must be stated that when the International Court of Justice issued its provisional measures, one of them was that Israel needed to, with immediate effect, lift the siege so that actual aid can be delivered to the people of Gaza. That was an explicit order. And the international law expert, Francis Boyle, who has argued cases of this nature before the court, he represented Bosnia against Serbia in the 1990s for the Srebrenica genocide. and won that case, said that the United States has now gone from being the armor of Israel and the defender publicly of Israel to now being a participant in violations of court orders citing the Genocide Convention by the world's highest court. So he recognized this as a very significant crime that the United States is now directly a party to, not just aiding and abetting, but is now a party to the underlying crime.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point about the domino effect, the 9 other countries that withdrew aid from UNRWA, all in total, it amounts to over half of the total aid that UNRWA usually receives. And they said they can only sustain their operations without some kind of cuts and changes to their capacity for about a month. So there have been efforts to fundraise for UNRWA, some of which have been thwarted by state governments. What is it, in the UK? There's an effort to say that giving to UNRWA is supporting a terrorist group. And is it from the government's perspective or from a banking system that is being used to try to thwart those payments?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, you have the U.S., you have Germany, Japan, Canada, France, Switzerland. I mean, there's any number of countries that have done this, and what we've seen since the war against Gaza began is not just attempts to cut off funding of Palestinian groups. I mean, this is particularly outrageous. The idea, this is akin to saying that it should be criminalized to give donations to UNICEF. I mean, it's
right.
One other thing that bears mentioning right now, Bree, and my shock radar is, it's hard to shock me. The Wall Street Journal on Monday, as all of this is happening and the focus is on, there were 12 UNRWA employees that Israel
out of 30,000, by the way, we should say that it's a huge agency.
Employees. Yeah, it's a massive
agency. It represented 0.04% of all employees. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
So no, it's fine. I mean, this has such whiffs of the buildup to the invasion of Iraq, which was based on lies. But the Wall Street Journal puts on its main webpage, right at the top, what purports to be an article based on what they call an intelligence dossier that says that it's far greater a problem than just these 12 individuals. That in fact, a full 10% of UNRWA employees are connected to Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And when you read down, so intelligence dossier, it's like I was having flashbacks to the Christopher Steele Russiagate stuff, but also to Judith Miller mushroom cloud stuff, because if you dig into the article, what they're saying is that the Israeli government provided this information to the United States government, and then the Wall Street Journal was able to review it. And it all basically is guilt by innuendo, and and it was devastating, because then because people don't read, they don't check facts. It just becomes, even in the liberal comment sphere, it became like, see, it's not just a few bad apples. This is pervasive throughout the organization. The lead author of that Wall Street Journal piece is herself a veteran of the Israeli Defense Forces, who has boasted that her closest friend basically created the social media strategy of the IDF, and that so it basically was laundering on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, an insidious, violent propaganda campaign being implemented by a government that just had a devastating set of rulings issued against it for plausible violations of the Genocide Convention, in service of trying to further starve the people of Gaza. And that narrative that was set last week and then doubled down on by the Wall Street Journal is now becoming the dominant narrative. And Antony Blinken on Tuesday, Bree, was asked about the evidence, and he said publicly that the United States had not done its own investigation, but that the allegations are very, very credible. I mean, think about that statement for America's top diplomat to admit to the world, we didn't bother to actually do our own investigation before we cut off funding to the most vital humanitarian organization operating in a country that is now under the watch of the World Court for a potential genocide. That is the top diplomat of the United States saying, we didn't bother to even look into this ourselves. We just believe notorious liars who have lied from the moment that this thing started, who have lied for decades about the Palestinians, whose entire worldview is dehumanize Arabs, dehumanize Palestinians, treat them as human animals. The United States is taking the word of that government to cut off funding to basically the only force in Gaza able to provide any meaningful aid and medical care right now to a people that could well be found to be victims of genocide. This is on a moral level. I find it difficult to imagine a more immoral stance than that which the United States is taking at this moment on this issue.
Yeah, when you said rarely have you been so shocked or rendered speechless by a sequence of events, I tend to agree. I really honestly can't get out of my head the idea that on a day that Israel is plausibly accused of genocide, the decision is to withdraw funding from a humanitarian aid organization servicing the population that is being genocided in that equation. And moreover, it really it stunk of retribution precisely because in South Africa's petition, so much of what the ICJ has to rely on a factual basis in terms of what are perceived to be credible interlocutors in Gaza are these humanitarian aid workers. And so it did really read, if you look at all of the statements about UNRWA prior to the ICJ filing from Kirby and other State Department officials, and juxtapose that with the immediate withdrawal of funds after a unsubstantiated allegation versus the very substantiated allegation that comes out of South Africa's 84-page petition. And then also read that alongside these remarks that people dug up from January 4th. I'm sure that you saw these as well. Noga Arbel, who was the former chair of the Foreign Ministry Workers Committee in Israel, made the case at the Knesset that you had to get rid of UNRWA. She said it will be impossible to win the war if we do not destroy UNRWA, and this discussion must begin immediately. Basically saying the quiet part out loud. And my understanding is also that UNRWA has all the humanitarian resources that we just described, but also is seen as a UN organization that's more likely to advance the cause of a right of return, and that Israel has been wanting Palestinians to be Palestinian aid to be lumped under one of the other agencies that doesn't have that same objective. And so it's also part and parcel of a goal to quash the ability of there not just to be a two-state solution, but any broader equality for Palestinians within the territory already described as Israel. So, I mean, in light of all of that context, the choice there does seem to be that much more galling. And I don't know what other way to slice it. And then to your point, the way there was immediately another layer of media cover provided in that subsequent follow-up article on Monday. After the weekend's news, Twitter went crazy. Everyone saw the obvious rank hypocrisy of it all. This very small fraction of people that were even being alleged to have done any wrong seemed to suggest there should be no action other than action against those 12 individuals in the interim of it actually being proven. So it seemed to require a follow-up that said, actually, it's not just these 12 people. And that's exactly what we got. And the near point that the person who wrote that article is themselves implicated. It's too much, honestly.
Well, imagine if, when President Obama came into office, prior to becoming president on the campaign trail, he talked a lot of talk about U.S. wars. He talked a lot of talk about U.S. torture and tactics that were used in the war on terror. And then he gets into office and he notoriously says we need to look forward, not backward, on the question of whether CIA operatives that engaged in torture should be held accountable under the law. Imagine, though, if Obama had applied the standard to the CIA that's being applied to the workers at UNRWA and said, well, these operatives of the CIA kidnapped people. They tortured them. They waterboarded them. They disappeared them into black sites. They committed all manner of violations of American law and international law and committed some of the most heinous crimes someone can commit against another human being. Imagine then if his response was, therefore, we need to cut off all funding to that agency. That's the standard that is being applied here. Or do Democrats in Congress believe that the entire U.S. Congress should be defunded because some Republicans were conspirators in the events of January 6th? You know, is this the standard now that we're going to apply?
Also, Israel's right there.
And is Israel, I mean,
right there.
Israel's committing war crime after war crime after war crime. And Biden is making sure, you know, if the Israelis, this is just something I think people, we don't hear about this enough, but it's totally true. There is a constant resupply of Israeli munitions going on. And if Israel was cut off, this would be over. This would be over. Not even to talk about Biden politically. This would be over. But the fact is, this administration engaged in a very cynical propaganda campaign where they were able to spin major media outlets to print stories about how Joe Biden is losing patience with Benjamin Netanyahu, about how Anthony Blinken is so distraught over the fate of Palestinian civilians and that they just desperately want this to, you know, the Palestinians to be okay. And yet their actions speak to that being a complete and total fraud. This is the prime exhibit to show the hypocrisy. Yeah. If they believed any of that, if any of that was true, they wouldn't, without even bothering to do their own independent investigation, cut off the funding to the only lifeline that is available. You know, Palestinians right now, there is one toilet for every 480 people right now. That is the average. The health ministry in Gaza says that the death toll has now eclipsed 26,000. Those are conservative numbers.
Right.
You know, people say, oh, the Hamas-run health ministry. First of all, recent investigative reporting in Israel has indicated that the IDF believes that those statistics are more accurate than the Israeli military statistics. But set that aside for a moment. In order to be recorded as dead by the Hamas-run health ministry, you have to either have gone through the hospital system, which has been decimated, or the mortuary system, which has been decimated. People are digging their own graves. They're digging mass graves. There are more than 7,000 Palestinians that are missing, most of them believed to be trapped under rubble. I think the death toll is far greater than what the Hamas-run health ministry has put out. And one final point on this, Bree, I spent quite a bit of time in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was president, you know, before shock and awe. And I knew so many Iraqis at so many levels of society who had to be members of the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein's ruling party, the Ba'ath Party, in order to have a job in civil society, as a teacher, as a public worker, you know, the whole workforce. Most people became members of the Ba'ath Party, not because they loved Saddam Hussein, but because that was the ruling authority. It was what they needed to do to pursue their jobs, their careers, their lives. It wasn't a country of corrupt people who all just, you know, loved everything Saddam Hussein did. It was just a fact of life. Hamas is not just the Qassam brigades. You know, people use the term Hamas with a very broad brush, and it might make for a good narrative, but it's far more complicated. So when you say, as the Wall Street Journal is alleging, based on this the laundering of Israeli so-called intelligence, that 10% of these people had connections to Hamas or Islamic Jihad, I'm sure the number is far greater than that. Because what do you mean by connection? Hamas is not just Qassam Brigade. Hamas is the ruling authority, whether you like them or not. They pick up the trash. They provide civil services. The laziness is also part of the banality of evil. Is the laziness among the public. Don't even bother to check. Well, what does that even mean? You know, when I read people are connected to Hamas, it's like, well, of course they are. You know, this isn't some scary smoking gun that you've produced for us. You know, and Hamas is much more complicated than the Qassam brigades and October 7th. This is a long story. And by the way, Benjamin Netanyahu has played a significant role in ensuring that Hamas would remain in power in Gaza. And they don't want to talk about that. In fact, what about Netanyahu's relationship to Hamas? Why isn't that the subject of a big Wall Street Journal piece about how maybe we should defund the Israeli government just because of Netanyahu's deep ties to Hamas and keeping that money flowing from Qatar?
Right. Let's call it Israel-backed Hamas, the way we say Iran-backed Houthis or whatever it is.
Well, it is US
Speaking
backed
of,
Israeli. I mean, we all should start just,
right.
really using, I know you do sometimes, I do sometimes, but it really should just become the default now. If those are the rules, we didn't make the
Yeah.
rules, Bree.
Right, right. Absolutely. And now, speaking of that kind of laziness and the public, there also has been, as you pointed out, some real lack of intellectual rigor or outright bias in the media coverage. There was another really great story out of the Intercept covering the scandal around the December 28th big New York Times story, which alleged widespread use of sexual violence on October 7th. Now, Ryan Grimm and Daniel Boguslaw covered over at The Intercept in their piece called Israel's War on Gaza. New York Times puts daily episode on ice amid internal firestorm over Hamas sexual violence article. Some new revelations that show that The Daily, which is the New York Times' daily podcast that often reprises some of the more significant New York Times reporting, was planning to put out an episode about that December 28th original article in the first week or so of January, on January 9th. But because of internal pushback at the New York Times, because of intrepid independent reporting, probably the likes of Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate at the Gray Zone, Electric Intifada, and others who investigated the claims made in that original New York Times article that seemed to be very flimsy and unsubstantiated. Witnesses, the families of alleged victims came forward subsequently saying that my family member was not in fact sexually assaulted. All of this kind of thing apparently raised enough eyebrows internally at the New York Times that people were like, you cannot put out this podcast without significant revisions. And as I understand it, it was embarrassing because either the podcast had to be so different than the original reporting as to raise questions about whether or not corrections should be made on the original reporting, or they had to perpetuate the lies that people at the New York Times are no longer willing to stand behind. Do I understand that right?
Yeah, and I think also, Mondo Weiss did a really strong, well-documented, footnoted piece criticizing this New York Times story where the lead reporter was Jeffrey Gettleman. And what I would say on this issue more broadly, and then I'll talk about the New York Times, is it wouldn't shock me at all if rapes occurred on October 7th, if sexual violence was meted out against women and possibly men on October 7th. But when you're going to make an allegation that Hamas came in with a premeditated plan to systematically rape women, which is what Israel has asserted. One Israeli spokesperson called Hamas a rapist machine. You need to be able to back up those assertions. And, so in terms of what evidence has been produced, there hasn't been any forensic evidence introduced. That doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't rapes. And as you know, Bree, rape prosecutions are not litigated before the cameras. These can be very complex investigations, particularly if they took place in the context of large scenes of violence and mob action or warfare. But what the New York Times did was to weave together this tapestry of innuendo and utilize witnesses whose credibility was called into question before they were even mentioned in the New York Times. There is evidence to suggest that some of the subjects of interviews for the New York Times were manipulated into A, speaking with the New York Times, and then B, getting themselves into a kind of labyrinth where they end up confirming a narrative that they later said does not represent what they actually believe. In fact, that family that you're referencing, some of whom immediately denounced the New York Times story and said it didn't represent their belief about what happened to their loved one who was murdered that day. Their photo is at the top of that site. Right. And there are extreme problems with that New York Times piece about its accuracy. And I think that if you read, there have been some very responsible articles written in the Israeli press where they've talked to investigators. And there is not a single case where anyone can point to it and say, aha, this is the definitive thing that happened. I think it's really a multifaceted tragedy, because if there were women that were raped, and there were women that were victims of sexual violence, they deserve justice, and their perpetrators should be brought to justice. And
that's the irony. The call has been for investigation. The UN said we needed to have an opportunity to investigate these claims exactly because of how serious they are. And Israel has resisted all outside external
Israel resisted a UN. The first UN team that was going to come, Israel said that these are anti-Semites and we're not going to let them in. And so then the UN Secretary General then had to come up with a different plan, and then ended up personally sending one of his envoys, and Israel welcomed that individual this week. And so that does seem like there's going to be, at least to some extent, Israeli cooperation. But the initial order from Israel was that their healthcare workers across the border are not to cooperate with the UN team that was going to be sent to investigate this. Another thing that I think is, must be mentioned, Hamas has vehemently denied this. And okay, you can say, oh, well, of course Hamas is denying it. Okay. Hamas has denied it. They said that this would violate their Islamic beliefs, the training that they've been given. But there's another fact that I think is really relevant if people actually care about what is true. Hamas was not the only group that day. Remember, right. October 7th began with a devastating multi-site attack on Israeli military installations. And I think we have to separate the attacks on military installations from the scenes in the kibbutzes and at the music festival, because of international law and because of the fact that under international law and the United Nations, Gaza remains an occupied territory with the right to self-defense. And Israel has engaged in illegal settlements, and the vast majority of Gazans are people that were expelled from their homes. This is just facts that bear mentioning.
Right.
But the other thing is, you had Hamas, its special units and other forces, Qassam brigades. You had a Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You had three to five other organized groups that may not have been involved with the planning, but I think Hamas alerted them late in the game, and they participated as well. But then you had a kind of second wave that took place on October 7th, where the prison walls were pierced, and Hamas and these groups were doing what they were doing. And then you had other people come in who had nothing to do with the planning, who sort of joined in the melee that took place that day. Some of the witnesses, purported witnesses, including a man who survived the killing at the Nova Music Festival, he claimed to have personally seen a woman being raped. And in one of the interviews that he gave, he said that the attackers, the assailants, and he kept saying it, were not Hamas gunmen. These were ordinary people. That's what he was saying. Now, that witness, we don't need to go down the rabbit hole, also has serious credibility problems that other journalists have written about. I'm just giving this as one example, because let's say it's true that this man witnessed a rape, and he himself is an IDF veteran, a security forces veteran of Israel. And he was clear that these were people that seemed to have just come in. They weren't professionals. They seemed to be doing mayhem for mayhem's sake, and they brutally raped and murdered a woman. Okay. From a law enforcement perspective, now you have a witness. We need to find the body. We're going to do a forensic examination. We're going to check the facts. There are Israeli investigators that, if you read accounts in Israel, that this is what they're trying to do right now, Bree. They actually are taking this seriously. They're not the ones that get quoted all over the place. But the point I'm making is,
well, and in fact, there was that piece, there was an article in Haaretz maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago where they had put out a call for anyone to come forward with evidence because those investigators were having such a hard time without any bodies and without any forensic evidence and without any witnesses of actually substantiating these claims, or the very limited witnesses that have been now resurfaced in multiple articles.
I mean, there are Israeli sources that deal with investigations of sexual crimes and other acts of violence that have said that they have identified a handful of women who they believe had been victims of sexual violence. They didn't necessarily say that they were victims of rape, and that that it's a very difficult process for those women. And I think that people need to be careful. People need to be careful about, but people need to be careful, you also can go too far in the other direction. What the point I'm getting at, though, is there's a difference between Hamas coming in on October 7th with a plan to systematically rape women and rapes and sexual violence that occurred that day that may have been
Right.
committed by other actors, and the facts matter. So,
and I think that's an important point. But I would also say that, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why the independent reporting has been so persuasive, it's not because it proves definitively that no sexual assault happened, which you obviously can't prove a negative, and the history of violence in the world suggests that anything is possible, if not likely, but because of it has been able to seemingly prove a number of lies that have been perpetuated that really go to the heart of the credibility of this argument that's being made by Israel, which is that this was systemic in nature. And once you start showing that the party that is, for whatever reason, fabricating these lies is in fact lying, when the truth, I would argue, is gruesome enough, then it starts to call into question any accusation, rightly or wrongly, because of how it's being very intentionally used in service of a political project. So I have seen some of this reporting that says there are witnesses that are alive that have been identified that talk about sexual violence, but they want to remain anonymous. Now, ordinarily, I would say, well, of course, I don't expect some sexual assault victim to trot out one of the worst days of their life before the public. That's not their responsibility. But it does them a disservice to the extent that those stories are true, because all of our willingness to believe that.
But I mean, part of what
it's tough.
Right. I mean, part of what I'm saying, though, is that, as someone who really does care deeply about the facts, as I know you do, I think on the one hand, we have the propaganda campaign, which clearly is riddled with lies, exaggerations, and is aimed at enforcing a dehumanization narrative that Israel hopes will continue to justify its mass slaughter of Palestinian civilians in Gaza. On the other hand, you have, I'm sure you have civil servants in Israel and people who work with survivors and victims of sexual violence that really do actually want to solve alleged crimes. And all I'm cautioning is that, is that we be careful with running away with our own narratives. I'm not saying by any means that you're doing
that. For sure. But I mean, I do think that even when there are allegations that are not disproven or disprovable, the fact that there has been so much lying in this area does make one want to put it in the shelf of maybe. That's all I'm saying. Like, maybe that might be substantiated. I'm open to that being true.
Yeah, I mean, here's another way, though, to kind of approach this. We're being asked to believe the following, that Hamas for years planned out this operation, that Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who spent 2 decades in Israeli prisons and actually told his Israeli interrogator that one day he's going to come and kill him. And Yahya Sinwar himself was released in a prisoner exchange when Gilad Shalit had been an Israeli soldier, had been taken captive to Gaza and held for years. We're being asked to believe that Hamas, which is a Palestinian liberation organization by doctrine that wants the Palestinian state and wants its prisoners freed, that somehow in its planning to take the Gaza division down, which it did, to kidnap soldiers and take them prisoner and bring them back to Gaza so that they can get as many of their prisoners out as they could, that they were going to have a side operation to go and make sure that you're systematically raping people.
It's bizarre.
Again, if you just look at it through the lens of everything we know about Hamas, the allegation on the surface seems insane to say that it was a systematic thing.
And we do have so much documentation, but there are the GoPro cameras that show you all kinds of things, all kinds of atrocities that just aren't rape. When Owen Jones came forward as one of the first non-Zionists to have witnessed this Israeli tape, the compilation of all the video footage, and said, I saw atrocities, but there was no sexual violence on the tape. I mean, he trended for like a week because Zionists were furious that he burst the bubble of what everybody was kind of breathlessly insinuating was going to be on that tape. And combined with that, we had stories like the father whose daughter had been taken hostage, and he said, I hope that she's dead, because we know what we know what Hamas does to women in captivity. And it turns out that she was alive and unmolested. And that story just kind of disappears. We had a story about another hostage where the headlines, who had been released, where the headlines very much insinuated that she had been sexually abused in some way. And when you read what she described, she says a Palestinian child offered me candy and then took it away, like offered me food and then snatched it away. And that was I was teased. It was framed with all the sexual innuendo. So when you have a clear media drive and push to frame everything, no matter how asexual it is, as that kind of conduct, I mean, it does. I take your point. It does a disservice to any real victims that are out there, but also it must be said that skepticism is the result of so many lies having been demonstrated by basic reporting that has endeavored to corroborate the witness testimony that can be lined up with various forensic facts that we know from the ground that day.
I mean, also, I'll go a little bit further too. Some of the Israeli officials from the IDF and civilian officials whose testimony to the public really reinforced the notion that there was widespread rape that took place and sexual violence against both soldiers, female soldiers, and civilians. Several of the people that are cited as the kind of authorities on this, and we're being asked to trust that what they told us they found in their examinations and their review of photographs and other evidence, they were the sources of some now completely definitively debunked assertions that were made about beheading babies and other allegations. And in a court of law, if the defense wants to put on a robust defense, they're going to say, well, let's look at the track record of this individual who made all these statements about what they, and it's not just like they got something wrong. They were making statements through, wearing the hat of we're professionals, and they were putting out totally fraudulent and recklessly doing so information that raises questions about whether or not it was intentional to put out this kind of propaganda. I mean, Zaka, the Israeli emergency response team, the head of that organization ran around the world telling all manner of lies. He seems to have been the source for a tremendous number of falsehoods that were actively promoted by both Blinken and Joe Biden. So, again, even if you just look at this exclusively through the lens of justice for victims, this conduct is contaminating the investigation. What should be an actual, but on the other side of this is part of a very, very ancient campaign to dehumanize Arabs, and particularly Arab men. It is an attempt to portray the enemy as savage barbarians who murder, loot, rape, and pillage for the sake of those things, rather than they're engaged in an attack that, from their perspective, is one battle in a 75-year war for liberation. People accuse me of being, I'm pro-Hamas. If you go back and look at everything I've ever said about Hamas, all I do is state factual information, about Hamas. And that somehow is being pro-Hamas. No, it's journalistic malpractice not to explain the stated intent or the response to allegations by a party that we're being told is tantamount to the Nazis and ISIS. It's journalistically responsible to say, hey, we're being told these guys are the new Nazis. Let's do some fact checking. Why don't we see if that's actually true? This is basic journalism.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of basic journalism, I will say there does seem to be some light at the end of the tunnel, cracks in the facade, whatever metaphor you want to use. CNN reported about a week ago for the first time, it acknowledged the 16 or so grave sites in Gaza that have been desecrated by the IDF. And then most recently sent reporters in to talk to soldiers at one of these grave sites, one of these cemeteries, about why they were doing this. Of course, it is a war crime to desecrate a cemetery unless it is narrowly tailored to some very clear military objective. In the course of their conversation, the IDF soldier, who interestingly has a South African accent, explains that they have found these tunnels, Hamas tunnels in the graveyard, which has necessitated its excavation.
A week ago, we did an investigation that identified 16 cemeteries damaged or destroyed by the Israeli military. In the wake of that reporting, the Israeli military actually invited us to join them inside southern Gaza, just east of Khan Yunis, in Bani Sahela, where that was one of the 16 cemeteries that we identified. They wanted to show us why they say they destroyed that cemetery, but ultimately, after a 3-hour visit, we really left with more questions than answers.
This is no ordinary quarry. It's where the living once buried their dead. Gaza's Bani Sahela cemetery, hollowed out by Israeli excavators.
These were all graves. This was a cemetery, but the military says that they were forced to come in here because they discovered a Hamas tunnel running right underneath that cemetery.
But the Israeli military failed to prove that stunning claim during a 3-hour tour of the area. They invited us here a week after we first uncovered this graveyard's partial destruction using satellite imagery, part of a CNN investigation that found 16 cemeteries in Gaza damaged or destroyed by the Israeli military.
This whole area here is a military compound. From the mosque over there, underneath the graveyard, all the way down north and south. My forces, the beginning, we try to flank this area. Were fired from this area again and again and again. We couldn't understand why.
So that's how you determined that there was a tunnel here, because you were being fired upon?
Yes, sir.
Our journey to investigate the Israeli military's claims begins in the rubble of what they say was a residential building.
Even just standing at the mouth of this tunnel, you can feel the humidity just like emanating here. And this is the way that we go in to what they say is an extensive tunnel system in Bani Sahela.
We descend into a dark, seemingly endless labyrinth. There's just tight spaces like this in certain parts of this tunnel. But then you get here and you have full headspace pretty much. All throughout it, you can see that there's electricity, there's telecommunications. The Israeli military says that this tunnel system actually leads to a Hamas command center, which they say was used by Hamas fighters to coordinate their attacks.
Reporters asked to see the tunnels, to film the tunnels. They say no, citing that it's dangerous for them to be near the tunnels because the ground is unstable or something like that. They follow up saying, okay, well, even if you don't let us film, can we just put our eyes on it so we can corroborate it? They're told no, but they're shown a photograph, an image of the photos. CNN is able to use satellite imagery to locate where the tunnels in those photos are. And when you look at the, from above satellite topographical image of where they're situated, it becomes clear that those tunnel entrances are not, in fact, in the cemetery.
Yeah.
But there's no way for us to verify whether we are actually beneath the graveyard. General Goldfuss takes us back out of the tunnel, but not into the cemetery. Instead, we leave the same way we came in, before walking back to the enormous hole where the cemetery once stood.
We're asking the general if we can actually see the shaft to the tunnel.
But the answer is no.
So?
There's all kinds of machinery which I don't want you to take pictures of. The security of my forces.
But what about if we don't film it? We just look with our eyes.
And then you might fall in, the whole thing can collapse. Or you have to walk to the edge is not secured. It can collapse, there's machinery, so on. It's not something I'm going to take a risk on. Sorry.
The Israeli military later provided this drone footage, showing the tunnel shaft we entered and another one nearby. CNN geolocated the footage using this satellite image. This outline shows where the cemetery once stood, and these are the two tunnel entrances clearly outside the graveyard. As for the tunnel they say they found here, where the cemetery once stood, the military never provided any evidence.
And we pressed the Israeli military multiple times for that evidence of this tunnel they say exists beneath the cemetery. Instead, they released another press release yesterday, which actually only poked more holes in the story that General Goldfuss told us. When we were in that command center that he said was beneath the cemetery, the press release that they released shows a map, and it actually places that command center well outside the cemetery bounds. Just more questions ultimately from this visit than we actually got answers or conclusive evidence.
That's an incredible bombshell. And at the fact that that's being reported in a mainstream outlet like CNN seems meaningful, though it doesn't seem to have had the kind of resonance in the public sphere about the nature of the Israeli occupation and siege, in the unjustified nature of it, in the criminal nature of it, that as one would expect. It certainly doesn't seem to have as much legs as a news story as the flimsy allegation that UNRWA is Hamas.
Well, remember too, the Intercept also did a report. It was also Daniel Boguslaw some weeks ago, showing that all of CNN's coverage of Israel or Palestine is routed through the Jerusalem Bureau, and the Jerusalem Bureau is subject to oversight by the Israeli censorship regime. So even if a reporter is writing something and that reporter is based in, Chicago, it's still, the content still has to be run through a bureau that is subjected to Israeli censorship. I agree that the CNN, look, the thing is, the New York Times, CNN, a bunch of American news outlets, they sporadically have done really good journalism that has given lie to Israel's claims, but it's the exception. The dominant sort of tone is always the number one rule: deference to Israel's narrative. That is the number one rule of how to cover anything involving Israel. You must defer to the narrative of the Israeli state. And that's what I think we see. Also, like Sky News, not anyone's idea of like radical independent media. You consistently see tough interviews with Israeli officials. But, the world is not changed and truth is not delivered to the public by once in a while doing a good thing. Sometimes the truth is just true. And I think that large American news organizations have done an immense disservice to the public in the way that they've covered this war in general. But also, dozens upon dozens of our colleagues have been murdered and their family members have been killed. And, the Washington Post has "Democracy Dies in the Darkness." Our colleagues were being murdered in broad daylight. I always stand up, whether it's a Fox News reporter or a Wall Street Journal reporter, if they're being put in jail or they're being threatened or targeted, I always speak up. And I'm really infuriated at the lack of solidarity we've seen as our colleagues have been systematically murdered, many of them with family members of theirs also being killed. In some cases, separate from the journalists themselves, they've been killed, or on multiple occasions, different family members have been killed. This looks like a killing spree aimed at journalists within a larger mass killing operation. So there is good journalism that's out there. I just think that the drumbeat coverage that we see to facilitate wars, all the lies that were repeated early on when independent journalists were questioning them, we've talked about a lot of them today, they were going along with it. CNN, promoted many of the most outlandish, obscene lies that Israel was deploying immediately to try to justify the slaughter that Netanyahu always knew he wanted to unleash on Gaza.
Well, let me ask you, what then do you make of, because on some level, I completely agree with you. On another level, there is enough breakthrough, and Israel's crimes are so, and in all caps and bold, that the plausible deniability that the United States, the Biden administration, whatever actor wants to stand in defense of Israel has relied upon historically seems to be wearing really thin. John Kirby, all of these folks seem to be dancing on the head of a pin, squirming and increasingly uncomfortable as they're being asked about rank hypocrisy.
Now, you're cutting off aid at a time when several human rights officials are really warning that Gaza is on the verge of starvation. It's a real possibility. These people are facing famine and starvation, and you cut off aid, because there is allegedly 12 people that are members of Hamas who have done this and so on. Out of 12,000 employees, you know? I mean, nobody talks about 158 employees by UNRWA, employed by UNRWA, that were killed by the Israelis. But, you know, I want to go back to the issue of famine and the likelihood of starvation, famine, and so on. What is your response to that?
So the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire. You have seen us focus from the beginning of this conflict on trying to improve the humanitarian situation. You've seen the Secretary travel to Israel to press Israeli officials to allow more humanitarian assistance to flow into Gaza. We have a special envoy we appointed who is in the region working every day on increasing the amount of food and water and medicine that goes into Gaza. And you have heard us say, and the Secretary traveled and met with members of UNRWA in the region, how important the work that UNRWA is, or that UNRWA does, is to Gaza and to civilians in Gaza. And it's important that work be continued. And I would say it is because that work is so important that it is also important that UNRWA and the United Nations take this investigation seriously. I note you said allegedly, and that is very much true, but UNRWA found that the evidence that was presented to them was credible enough that they fired 8 of these employees and have suspended 2 others. And so we think the work's important, but this is an investigation that needs to be conducted thoroughly. There needs to be accountability. If appropriate, there need to be remedial measures to ensure that this can't happen again. And there's no reason that the United Nations can't do this investigation quickly. And in fact, because of the important work that UNRWA does, it's important that they can carry out this investigation quickly.
So what would be satisfactory for the United States and its allies to sort of say, okay, aid will resume?
So I only speak for the United Nations, or for the United States, not for other countries, but the steps that I just outlined are what we want to see. A full investigation, and as we said in the statement we put out on Friday, and we have said since then, we welcome the investigation that the United Nations has launched. We want to see accountability. We've seen initial steps to accountability, and that UNRWA has fired 8 of the employees and suspended 2 others while they conduct the investigation. And we want to see measures put in place to ensure, to the extent possible, that this can never happen again. And so we are engaging with UNRWA. We are engaging with the United Nations about what those steps ought to look like. I won't read out the details of those conversations, but they are in the buckets that I just outlined.
They're saying things like, you know, the quote that you mentioned earlier about Kirby finding the UNRWA accusations very credible despite not having reviewed any of that evidence.
That was
Apparently
Blinken.
not having. Oh, sorry, Blinken saying that. Apparently not having very much to say at all about the 152 UNRWA employees that have been killed by Israel since this conflict started, not to mention the over 100 journalists, as you just referenced, who've been killed. And now you have Biden basically not being able to give a speech anywhere without the protesters confronting him. Nancy Pelosi was obviously just confronted at her house, and she called the protesters Chinese agents that go back to China where your headquarters are.
No, it was an inside job.
Most of your constituents want stop the genocide, stop the Holocaust.
The Democrats want the ceasefire. The Democrats want the ceasefire. The Democrats want the ceasefire.
I mean,
The day before they were Russian agents, and then they became Chinese agents.
right, exactly.
For them to call for a ceasefire is Mr. Putin's message. Mr. Putin's message. Make no mistake, this is directly connected to what he would like to see. Same thing with Ukraine. It's about Putin's message. I think some of these protesters are spontaneous and organic and sincere. Some, I think, are connected to Russia. And I say that having looked at this for a long time now. As you know,
think some of these protests are Russian plants?
These are plants. I think some financing should be investigated. And I want to ask the FBI to investigate that.
And then AOC has gotten a great deal of pushback because she's done a couple of interviews now where she said, look, I don't associate myself with the Biden administration. I distance myself from that, but ultimately doesn't seem willing to detach herself, at least from the electoral aspect of endorsing Biden, saying that he is the best alternative to Donald Trump, even as he is committing a genocide against 2.3 million people.
Just to be clear, though, do you think the president's the strongest person to take on Mr. Trump if he is the nominee? It's still an if.
Yes. And I mean, especially when we look at this field, we have, Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson. President Biden, I think without question, among that field is the strongest nominee.
So, I mean, how are you reading all of this? To me, the effect of there being some media breakthrough isn't to change the administration's behavior per se, but it does seem to be highlighting some of the deficiencies of progressive elected officials who are trying to straddle the line. And also really, I think, cutting to the heart of the vote blue no matter who narrative, because I think unlike in previous moments, there is the more credible argument that Joe Biden facilitating, funding a genocide is at least as bad as anything that we've seen Donald Trump do.
Look, the vote shaming is going to be so strong in this election. And what I would say to people right now is if your plan is to go and berate people for having the audacity to say that they don't want to vote for Joe Biden, let's see what you're doing right now. Are you pulling out all stops to try to end U.S. support for this genocidal war? Did you do everything you could to pressure the Democratic Party not to run Joe Biden again, which most Democrats don't even want him to be running in the first place? I mean, the best way to ensure that you're going to have no influence whatsoever is to start endorsing someone when they're in the middle of a genocide, because that means there's nothing that Joe Biden could ever do that would cause any of these politicians to say, oh, no, we're getting off we're not riding with Biden anymore. So.
Well, so then how would AOC answer that question? That series of questions you just posited?
I mean, I think that first of all, I'd like to see what efforts did she make. And I think she should talk about this. What efforts did she make to pressure the Democratic Party and Biden personally not to do it? Don't be the candidate this time. I'd like to see that. I'd also like to understand what exactly have you done to try to bring a forceful end to this U.S. support for genocide. I also think that you could be far more critical of Biden directly right now. People say, "Oh, this is going to hurt him against Trump." I think it would show that there's some heartbeat left in the Democratic Party. Biden should be directly attacked right now by Democratic politicians for what he's doing. Anyone that wants to claim that they have a moral code, you can't just send politely worded letters. You can't just direct your anger toward Benjamin Netanyahu. They're going to make Netanyahu. It's going to all be piled on Netanyahu. Biden enabled the whole thing. So
right, and yet, Jeremy, I mean, Bernie endorsed Biden like literally the day that he announced, right? Or the day after, something like that.
Bernie also was pretty bad early on in this, in this slaughter. Bernie ended up doing the single most sort of spine-having thing in this whole ordeal when he tried, I don't know even what the right way to put it. I mean, when he tried to do the most minimal thing you could possibly imagine in the United States, let's make sure that we're following our own laws by, giving military assistance to Israel. But even Bernie has been,
he still won't call for a ceasefire.
Right. That's what I'm saying. I mean, it's so like the best you have to offer. I mean, you worked for the guy, was this effort that he made. And I'm glad that he did it. I thought it was really clarifying that only 11 United States senators, which was quite amazing given that the Republicans portray Biden as the head of the kingpin of this crime family. And then you have an actual chance to say, oh, Biden's breaking the law, and only Rand Paul from the Republicans, votes in favor of it. But you're asking a serious question about the electoral politics. And I think what do you say? I would say to AOC, what do you say to a family in Dearborn, Michigan, who is Palestinian American, that has had dozens of their family members murdered with American bombs? You make the case, don't make the case to me, make the case to them, because you know what? That should be the gold standard. The gold standard should be make that case to American voters whose loved ones have been killed en masse in Gaza by American bombs with the full support of the man you're telling them to vote for. I want to hear that argument made. You can go on these kind of, fluffy shows and talk about, oh yeah, I don't agree with him on this. No, make that argument. Make an argument why people whose families have been murdered with American bombs with the full support of the American political establishment, why they should be voting for Joe Biden the man who has single-handedly made this all possible for Israel to do. That's what my answer is to AOC. Don't run around telling people like me why we should vote for Biden. Let's hear you publicly make the case why a Palestinian voter in this country whose loved ones have been murdered, why should they be voting for Joe Biden? And why should they be declaring that support in January of 2024 when the election is 11 months away?
Right. And to be clear, AOC also caught flack for endorsing Biden earlier than people thought she needed to. It was July of last year. So just as primary candidates were declaring and getting into this thing. I think I would suspect, look, AOC is not Joe Biden. And I know that there is a kind of my side of the left gets caricatured as being sort of unfair to her. But I would say I would have, of course, acknowledge. I don't think that I believe her. I believe her when she says she's disgusted and doesn't want to be associated with Joe Biden. My critique isn't to kind of project that she somehow doesn't care about all these things she once believed that she cared about with respect to Israel-Palestine, but only that she's unwilling to do the thing that would manifest that caring. Like, so I think if asked, if really, really pressed, she might say something like, well, I wouldn't tell that Dearborn Arab American to vote for Biden. But the hope is still implicitly that enough other Americans vote for Biden, that Biden gets elected. And so what does that mean? What are the implications of that? That you're still rooting for the guy that the Dearborn person won't vote for.
But I wasn't raising it as though the only relevant, party is to go and tell an Arab American in Dearborn, Michigan, whose family members have been killed in Gaza. It's that it speaks to something, I think, much deeper that, yeah, I
think that's what I'm getting at too. So I think that there's I'm just pointing out that the literal answer is that I think that AOC and others in her position are just doing avoidance, acknowledging because they're not inhumane that of course they would never want to want to force someone whose family members had literally been killed in Gaza into that position. But what they need to be forced to contend with is that their political project implicitly demands that Dearborn person has as their president Joe Biden, because they were too afraid, too threatened, too coerced, too cowardly to advocate for an alternative. Especially at a time months or years ago when it was more possible that alternative could have actually won.
But when are we gonna? I mean, I know you and I have both been having this discussion for basically as long as we've been adults. But look at this system that has been forced upon all of us in this country, where by the Democratic Party, has a PhD in losing crucial elections. In 2000, it was Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, it's his fault. Right. that Al Gore wasn't the president of the United States. With Hillary Clinton, it was the left and Jill Stein, that did her in. And this time around, again, it's going to be, if Joe Biden loses it, they're going to go after the left again for, I don't know who the new boogeyman will be. Will it be Cornel West? Will it be Jill Stein again? But that's going to play out again. But what do all these politicians, it's like, you can't be a vegetarian between meals. What were you doing between these elections to alter this? I actually think that I would love to hear politicians talk about that and say, you know what? I did. I was on the phone every day begging these people, do not run Biden again. I was telling Biden, come on, it's one term. You saved the world from Donald Trump. You don't need to do this again. But that's not what this party is. And they've made it so clear to us. That's not what the Democratic Party is. And, the fact that Joe Biden is endangering the world by continuing this, because if they lose that election, it will be their fault. And Donald Trump could end up winning the presidency. And it's not going to be the fault of Cornel West or the Arab Americans of Dearborn, Michigan. It's going to be the fault of Joe Biden and the establishment Democratic Party, which was supported by all factions within it.
Yeah, I agree. Look, the polls are not looking good in the same way that the polls didn't look good in 2016, but the Democratic Party would rather thwart Bernie Sanders than elect someone who every poll in the world showed was more likely to be Donald Trump. They chose their status quo over saving democracy, or however they are always framing the fight against Trump. But to touch on that last point, and I know I've already had you for an hour, but I just want to ask you quickly, because we haven't touched upon the most recent developments with the killing of the 3 troops in, I'm hesitating only because there's some dispute about where this Tower 22 base really is. on the borderline here. Was it in Jordan? Is it in Yemen?
Mhm.
But in the pending
Jordan or Syria.
Jordan or Syria, I'm sorry. The potential escalation as a consequence of these now more frequent skirmishes that have now resulted in the loss of 3 American lives.
I do hold them responsible in the sense that they're supplying the weapons to the people who did it. We'll have that discussion. We'll see. I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East. That's not what I'm looking for.
As we're talking about the stakes of the election, one of Joe Biden's arguments in 2020 was that you had to elect him because Donald Trump was a president that could start a war with Iran without congressional approval. And now America is arguing, without any evidence, by the way, that this was an Iranian-directed attack, that it was, in fact, Iran that is responsible, and Joe Biden has pledged to, quote, respond.
I mean, I think that there's, first of all, this business about Iranian-backed. There is a lot of, frankly, just a lot of bullshit that's been hurled around about this. I think this notion that Iran is somehow the grand puppeteer. Probably the Iranians like the fact that the United States gives them so much credit. It's just not backed up by fact. I mean, the reality is that Iran is the most powerful nation state within a loose alliance of forces, some of which represent states, some of which are movements, and it includes Islamic resistance in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Ansar Allah. People just say the Houthis, but it's Ansar Allah in Yemen. And I think that there is far too much credit or blame, depending on how you look at it, put on Iran in these cases. Having said that, I think Biden knows very well that it would be beyond catastrophic for the United States to wage a full war with Iran. I don't think that that's what Biden wants right now. I honestly don't. I think it would be an utter catastrophe for Biden to have a full-blown war with Iran. I do think that Biden is playing with fire by launching these attacks against Yemen, launching the attacks within Iraq. And, if Israel starts to go into a full-blown war against Lebanon, the U.S. has indicated that would be a red line of sorts. But Netanyahu clearly wants to pull the United States into a war with Iran.
I mean, what does that mean for it to be a red line for us? Israel goes into full-blown war with Lebanon, and then what does that mean? We stop sending Israel military at that juncture?
No. I think that
it's a red line in terms of us getting all the way on board into war.
Yeah, I think that I don't think that the United States would. The United States has said that a red line for it, a point where it would believe that the conflict is going too far, is if Israel gets into a full-blown war with Lebanon, but they haven't defined what that even means.
Yeah, so what does that change about our behavior?
No, it doesn't change anything about our behavior. But I think what the United States is setting these limits in an effort to distract from the excessive support it's already giving to Israel for a scorched earth campaign in Gaza. But what I'm saying concretely is I really don't believe that people like William Burns or Lloyd Austin, for that matter, think it's a good idea for the United States to go to a full overt war against Iran. The problem is that Biden is playing with fire, but I don't know, maybe people will attack me for this or say that I'm, being too soft on Biden. I just don't see it. I don't think it's in Biden's political or geostrategic interest to have a war with Iran.
But that's the problem. But what does that mean? I mean, it does feel like, whether it's just to manage the
what are you saying, that the United States is going to go and do regime change in Iran? I don't see it happening imminently.
But my problem is that if America, when it says there's a red line, doesn't articulate what that means in terms of what its policy would be, that it is saying, I will no longer support Israel. I'm going to actually withdraw my financial support or
No, of course, the United States is not going to
weapons
say
aid.
that. Under Joe Biden, they're never going to say that.
Well, that's the thing. So what does it mean? Like, what disincentive does Israel possibly have not to do all the wars with Lebanon or anybody else that it wants to, knowing that it can fully, indefinitely rely on U.S. support in an unqualified fashion?
Yeah. I don't think that there's any chance that the U.S. is going to threaten or withhold military assistance to Israel in any event, including war with Lebanon. I think, though, that the point I was getting at is that the U.S. has said it's a red line. I think this is part of this propaganda campaign where they leak what Biden really thinks about things to the media as a way of, communicating with Netanyahu. Netanyahu, though, has shown he doesn't care. He doesn't really care. In fact, he's calling Biden's bluff nonstop about all of this stuff. But the other thing is, in 2021, the last time that Bibi, unloaded on Gaza, it took one phone call from Biden to end it. He told him it's done. And within 2 days, Bibi was talking to the Egyptian negotiators, and then they brokered a ceasefire and it was over. Anybody who says, oh, Biden doesn't have the power to do it, he can do it. But part of what I'm saying is that these guys have chosen this spin campaign instead of making a really direct and clear American policy, public, to say to Netanyahu, we will not support you if you do this. Instead, they're saying, oh, well, we've drawn a red line around Lebanon. The United States is not going to stand by for, full-blown war in Lebanon.
At the same time that you're saying, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm saying that I don't believe that Biden is going to respond to the drone strike that killed 3 service members by going to full-blown war against Iran. I think that what Biden is doing in Yemen right now is almost entirely pointless from a strategic perspective. Ansar Allah is not going to stop. It's not going to lift the blockade of the Red Sea port. What we mostly have seen Biden engaged in are strategic soft strikes. Yes, real people die. I'm not minimizing that, but the United States is an incredibly powerful military. If they wanted to obliterate Yemen, they could do it instantly. If they wanted to go fight a war against Iran, that's tough. Iran has a real military. Iran has a real ground force. Iran is not Hamas, and Hezbollah is not Hamas for that matter. So I'm just saying that there's nothing that indicates to me that Biden is down with a full-blown war against Iran. You can have me back and call me out if I'm wrong about that.
No,
I don't think I am.
That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that if Biden says, if American service members are killed, we will respond, and then we respond, and then because we've got a zillion troops in the Middle East for some reason, more American service members, it seems inevitably will be targeted and killed, and we keep responding. I don't where does that lead? I mean, at what point do you call it a war? I don't mean, I'm not trying to be pedantic.
No, I mean, those are all really fair questions. And I'm not I'm the last person who's in the inside circle in Washington, D.C. I'm just saying, from my study of both Biden and American policy, I think that what they're trying to do right now is appear tough. And so they're launching their missiles, they're doing these strikes. But the question you're asking actually is like the $64 million question. To where does this lead? And the reason I keep saying, but he's playing with fire, I'm saying I don't think he wants a wider war against Iran. I certainly do not believe that that's what Biden wants, certainly not right now. But I keep saying they're playing with fire for the reasons that you just articulated, which is that when you do start engaging in a multinational bombing campaign, while you're simultaneously bankrolling, arming, and offering the most crucial political and diplomatic support to Israel as it wages a war of annihilation, you may not be able to choose when you're at war. And I think that the United States is pouring kerosene all over the Middle East right now. But I also think that there are indications that CIA Director Burns and Defense Secretary Austin, to some extent, are voices of restraint within the administration when compared with Blinken, Kirby, Sullivan, all of these people who are unrepentant, hawkish characters. And I think Burns in particular does not want the United States, the CIA director does not want the United States to go into an open war with Iran. I'm sure he's deeply concerned about this. This isn't an endorsement of Burns. I'm just talking about study of history and what I understand about these officials. So if I'm wrong, I'll cop to it. I'll own it. I just don't believe they want that war. And I think Biden's playing with fire by trying to have it both ways.
Yeah. Well, look, Jeremy, I really appreciate being able to pick your brain about these things. You're so knowledgeable. You're so succinct. And to that end, I would also really recommend my audience listen to your most recent episode of Intercepted. You had a great guest talking about everything that's going on in Yemen. And you and Murtaza talked to her. She was fabulous. I listened to that on my walk home today. So strong recommend. Can you tell the audience where to find more of you and your work more generally on the internet and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually just at theintercept.com. Our podcast is Intercepted. Even though, it's like walking through a wasteland, I'm still on the artist formerly known as Twitter. At my full name. I somehow can't quit it, Bree.
It's important. People made fun of me because I had Twitter Blue before Elon made it mandatory.
I follow all your little scandals, Bree.
So you're aware?
No, I remember that.
I've always said, I'm not going to gaslight the public about how important Twitter is to me when I'm trying to write things and keep track of arguments. So many good arguments get made in various Twitter threads. I'm like, oh yeah, that was a good point. And that was a good point. When I'm trying to find clips that I've seen, when I'm trying to find articles that people have written, I know that you can either find them in my timeline or my liked list. It's like an anthology of every stray thought that's ever crossed my mind. I screen grab. I have layers of remembering. Sometimes I just screen grab on my phone. Yeah, come back to this tweet if it's something that I can't really like because I don't agree with it, or I'm going to get in trouble for liking it because now I'm a fascist or something. I literally don't know how I would keep facts straight and keep information cataloged if not for Twitter, and how I would have access to guests who I can just DM because they're mostly mutual follows without Twitter. And that represents years of work and relationship building to get to a place where people want to follow me back so that I can access them to talk to them, to pick their brains. I've just been able to pick your brain here. So I will be devastated. I'm on some level rooting for Elon to have a good website because I need Twitter to be good. I'm rooting against my better judgment.
I will say there have been flashes of the old days there are so many Palestinians that are actually posting, and not just Palestinians, lots of people that are very closely monitoring these events.
Yeah.
It's actually been a remarkably good source of information during this crisis.
Yes.
And I'm really grateful for all of the people, particularly Palestinians in Gaza, who have been utilizing social media to be the eyes and ears of the world, for all of us. And they deserve all of our gratitude and support. So there's some flashes of hope there. I mean, it's a toxic dumpster fire in so many ways, but it has its moments where, during this, where I think it actually has, it's been a vital place where people can read independent views from the ground.
Absolutely. Also, Jeremy, did you see that one tweet when Ron DeSantis dropped out? And it was that meme from the Barbie movie where she goes from her foot being on tippy toe like Barbies are to going flat because of the accusation that he wears shoes, high heels, lifts.
I didn't see. How did I miss that? I must have been looking at some horrifying images.
Sometimes Twitter just really nails the moment. It really nails a pop culture, political crossover moment. I am
I'm too old. It flew above my head. I was so blissfully ignorant of everything happening in that so-called Republican primary. I was so happy that I paid absolutely
it's not over, Jeremy. You're not on the Haley train. Haley's rocket. Haley's rocket to nowhere. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's I'm really, really proud of the fact that I know absolutely nothing about what's going on with that Republican primary, except that Donald Trump is winning. That's all I know.
Yeah. Well, count your blessings. Thank you again for all of your time. You've been so generous, Jeremy.
All right. Say hello to Vladimir Putin in China and thank them for making sure that you keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, we'll do. We're all going to brunch on Sunday. All right.
All right.
Take care, and thank you to the audience. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you, and as always, keep the faith.